Captain Alistair Kell almost threw the Davos tip in the discard tray, and for the rest of his life he would wonder what would have happened to Operation SafeHaven if he had, because the note itself looked like nothing. 3 typed lines from a junior clerk in Bern, forwarding a rumor about a Swiss mountain town with an unusual number of German patients, filed under a case number so low on the priority list that it had been sitting in his in-tray for 11 days before he even opened the folder. He did not know, on the gray October morning he finally read it, that the scrap of paper in his hand was the loose thread that would eventually unravel a financial network stretching from the vaults of the Reichsbank in Berlin to a tuberculosis clinic in the Swiss Alps to a humanitarian relief pouch crossing the Turkish border, and that following it would cost him 4 months, 2 reprimands, and very nearly his career. He also did not know that the war in Europe was, by then, already over. He knew that, obviously everyone knew that, but he did not yet understand what it meant for men like him, that the shooting had stopped, but the money had not. By the autumn of 1945, the Economic Warfare Department's outpost in the British legation at Bern had become a kind of paper ocean, and Kell had spent the better part of 6 months learning to swim in it. Manifests, bills of lading, currency transfer authorizations stamped by clerks in Zurich who had signed thousands of documents without ever once looking up to ask what any of them actually meant. Kell had a talent, the only real talent he'd discovered in himself since joining the department, for reading that ocean the way a fisherman reads a current, not chasing any single wave but noticing the pattern underneath it, the places where the water moved wrong. It was, he privately thought, not unlike the work he'd done before the war, auditing shipping insurance claims in Liverpool, a job so tedious that his own father had once asked, not unkindly, whether Alistair intended to spend his whole life finding other people's mistakes instead of making anything of his own. Kell had never quite answered that question. He suspected some days that the war had simply given his talent for other people's mistakes somewhere useful to go. He was good at it. He was also, if he was honest with himself, still smarting from the one time he hadn't been. 8 months earlier, in Lisbon, he had spent 3 weeks tracking a shipment of Portuguese wolframite he was certain was bound for a German front company, only to watch the case collapse when his superior decided the paper trail was too thin to justify upsetting a neutral government during the war's final stretch. The company in question had gone quiet for 6 weeks and then resurfaced, under a different name with the same directors and the same address. Kell had been right. Being right hadn't mattered. He had learned from that a lesson he wasn't proud of, that finding the truth and being permitted to act on it were 2 entirely different achievements, and the department rewarded only one of them. So when the Davos rumor crossed his desk, unusual numbers of German patients, several sanatoria, apparently owned by the same shadowy trust, more security around a health resort than seemed remotely necessary for a health resort, Kell recognized, with the particular cold clarity of a man who has been burned once already, exactly how easily this could become Lisbon all over again. He filed it anyway. Some instinct, half professional and half stubborn, told him the water was moving wrong. He spent the next 9 days doing what he did best, reading Swiss company registries, German export licenses from before the war, a confidential 1939 Economics Ministry directive that had come into Allied hands through a captured courier, outlining, in the bloodless bureaucratic language the Nazi state used for almost everything, even genocide. How German-owned enterprises abroad should be legally severed from their parent companies while remaining, in practice, entirely controlled from Berlin. Kell read that directive 3 times. It was not dramatic. It talked about trusteeships and shareholding structures and the careful selection of foreign personnel with the tone of a company handbook. That was precisely what made his skin crawl. Somewhere in Berlin, a functionary had sat at a desk in September 1939, with the Wehrmacht pouring across the Polish border and the war beginning in earnest, and had devoted his working day to writing careful instructions on how German money should learn to disguise itself as something else: Swiss, Portuguese, Argentine, anything but German, so that it could keep moving through the world unmolested while everything else in Europe burned. The instructions had a phrase in them that stuck with him. The goal was for the disguised companies to become fully authenticated as independent foreign enterprises. Not merely to look independent, to be authenticated as such, to pass every test an investigator like Kell might throw at them. It was, he realized with a kind of grim, professional respect he hated himself for feeling, the same discipline as his own. Whoever had written that memo had understood exactly what a man like Kell would look for, and had built the camouflage specifically to survive that scrutiny. He began cross-referencing the Davos property registries against the trusteeship model the memo described, and the pattern he'd half suspected began to sharpen into something almost too clean to be coincidence. Hotels quietly converted into sanatoria, ownership rooted through trusts, with Swiss names attached, but German money underneath. A tuberculosis charity whose officers, when Kell checked them against captured party membership records, turned out to hold senior rank in organizations that had nothing to do with medicine. He took his findings to his section head, a weary career diplomat named Pemberton Hale, who had spent the war balancing Allied intelligence demands against the delicate business of not offending a neutral country Britain still needed. A Swiss mountain town full of sick Germans, Pemberton Hale said, not looking up from his own paperwork, is not on its own evidence of a criminal conspiracy, Kell. It's evidence of a war. We shot rather a lot of German soldiers. Some of the survivors have weak lungs. With respect, sir, the pattern of ownership is exactly the kind of pattern you found in Lisbon. Pemberton Hale finally looked up, and there was no cruelty in his expression, which somehow made it worse. I supported you in Lisbon. I don't relish being made to look a fool twice in 1 year over a hunch about hotel deeds. Kell felt the old, cold humiliation rising in his chest, and recognized, distantly, that everyone in that office now believed his interest in Davos was really about proving Lisbon hadn't been his fault. He wasn't entirely sure they were wrong about that either, but he made himself say what he'd actually come to say. Then let me follow the trust structures instead of the patients. If the ownership is clean, I'll drop it within the week, and you'll never hear Lisbon mentioned again. If it isn't, he hesitated and then pressed on, because pressing on was the only thing he still knew how to do with any confidence. If it isn't, sir, then somewhere in Berlin there's a filing cabinet full of instructions on exactly how to build the thing we're looking at. And if we don't pull this thread now, while the paperwork still exists, and the people who wrote it are still findable, we will never see the shape of it again. It will simply disperse. That's what it's designed to do. Pemberton Hale was quiet for a long moment, turning his pen over in his fingers in a way Kell had learned over 6 months to recognize as the only outward sign the man ever gave of actually thinking. 1 week, he said finally. Trust structures only. If you so much as mention the word conspiracy in a report I have to forward to London, I will personally see to it you spend the rest of this posting auditing ration coupons. Kell did not need a week. He needed 11 days, and by the 6th of them he had stopped sleeping properly, which he would later recognize as the surest sign he'd been right all along. The trust structures led him first to a holding company operating under a name that translated roughly as a Humanitarian Tuberculosis Aid Society, a name so aggressively boring that Kell had nearly skipped past it twice. It owned, on paper, one modest sanatorium. It also, once he traced its shareholders through 3 further shell layers, turned out to control the majority of German-linked medical properties in the entire town, along with a so-called German Aid Association that Kell increasingly suspected functioned as a local party office in all but name, and 2 private schools where, according to a badly typed and heavily redacted diplomatic complaint, he found buried in a different file entirely, sick German children were apparently being educated in considerably more than mathematics and grammar. It was the schools that made something in Kell go quiet and cold. He had spent 9 days thinking about this as a financial puzzle, clever, elaborate, almost admirable in its architecture, the way a difficult crossword can be admirable, even as you resent it for taking your whole evening. The schools reminded him it was not a puzzle. It was ideology wearing an accountant's disguise, patiently building its next generation in a country that had been generous enough to take in its sick. He widened the search, and that was when the shape of it stopped being a single Swiss town and became something considerably larger. The same camouflage discipline, the Swiss trustee names layered over German control, the careful legal severing that meant nothing in practice, appeared again in a Basel research institute that had opened its doors only months earlier, publishing a tropical medicine journal in a landlocked country with no tropical colonies and no obvious reason to care about tropical disease at all, except that its list of contributors read like a reunion of chemists who had, until recently, worked for Germany's largest industrial combine. Kell recognized a combine's name from a different file altogether. It held the patent on the poison used in the extermination camps, and it had operated a forced labor plant beside one of them. And running quietly beneath both threads, humming along almost invisibly, was a third, the International Relief Organization whose neutral, humanitarian mail pouches had, according to intercepted cables, and at least 2 confessions Kell found on file from captured agents, occasionally been used to move concentrated wealth and even hidden correspondence across borders that were, for everyone else, sealed tight by war. None of these 3 things, a health resort, a scientific journal, a charitable pouch, looked on its own like anything at all. That Kell understood now, sitting in a cold office at 2 a.m, with 3 case files spread in front of him, like the pieces of a machine he had not been meant to see assembled, was the entire point. The 1939 memo hadn't just instructed German money to disguise itself as Swiss. It had, almost by instinct, favored disguises built from things nobody wanted to look at too closely: sickness, science, charity, because scrutiny of those things felt, to any decent person, faintly indecent in itself. Who interrogates a tuberculosis patient's finances? Who audits the Red Cross? He had been hunting a rumor about hotel deeds. He had found, instead, the architecture of an entire hidden economy, built specifically to survive people like him by hiding inside the one category of institution people like him had been trained never to suspect. He brought it to Pemberton Hale 11 days later with a folder considerably thicker than the one he'd been given permission to open. "You said trust structures only," Pemberton Hale said, flipping through it with an expression Kell couldn't entirely read. "The trust structures led somewhere, sir. They led to an accusation that Nazi money is moving through the International Red Cross. They led to evidence, sir, not accusation. I've been careful about the distinction. I know how thin that line looked in Lisbon." Pemberton Hale set the folder down and rubbed his eyes, and for a long moment Kell genuinely could not tell whether he was about to be commended or dismissed from the department entirely. "You understand," Pemberton Hale said slowly, "what happens if this becomes public before we've verified every page of it. Half of Geneva will call it slander against the one institution everybody in this war still wants to believe was clean. The Swiss will call it an insult to their neutrality. And if a single fact in here turns out to be wrong, London will use it as an excuse to shut SafeHaven down entirely and call the whole hunt for hidden Nazi money finished business, because everyone above me would very much like it to be finished business." "Then we verify it," Kell said, "page by page. I'll take responsibility for every line." "You'll take responsibility whether you like it or not," Pemberton Hale said, not unkindly, "because I am now going to put your name on the covering memo, Captain. And if you're wrong about this the way you were nearly wrong about Lisbon, it will not be my career that ends. Go and get some sleep. You look like one of your own Davos patients." What followed took the better part of 2 more months, and Kell, who had joined the department expecting the satisfaction of a clean-solved case, learned instead the slower, more exhausting truth of how these things actually ended, not with an arrest, not with a triumphant unmasking, but with a grinding accumulation of confirmed pages, each one a small, undramatic victory that meant nothing on its own and everything in aggregate. Diplomatic pressure built quietly through the winter. Swiss authorities who had spent the war years finding it politically convenient not to look too closely at Davos began under mounting attention from the British and American legations in Bern to look. Newspapers that had opposed the Nazis throughout the war published lists of names. Expulsion orders followed, slow and bureaucratic, exactly the way everything in this hidden war had been bureaucratic. Officials given weeks to pack rather than hours to flee, holding companies formally dissolved on paper, long after their actual influence had already begun quietly relocating elsewhere. Kell watched much of it from behind a desk, filing supplementary reports, and felt considerably less triumphant than he had expected to feel. The men whose names appeared on the expulsion lists were, for the most part, minor administrators, hotel directors, bookkeepers, a schoolmaster. The architecture itself, the deeper financial machinery that had designed the camouflage in the first place, proved far harder to touch. Several of the Swiss banks, as evidence, implicated as conduits for the money, continued operating exactly as before, protected by a neutrality nobody in London seemed prepared to spend real political capital challenging. The industrial combine behind the Tropical Medicine Journal restructured, renamed subsidiaries, and quietly continued doing business, some of it eventually with the very governments that had spent 2 years trying to trace its wartime assets. Late in the process, buried in a British file he was not supposed to have seen, Kell came across something that soured the whole exercise for him in a way none of the Swiss front companies had managed to. An American Mauyer who had spent the years before the war representing the same chemical combine, and whose own brother had once sat on that combine's board, was by then running networks of intelligence agents against the very state whose economic interests he had previously helped protect. Nothing in the file suggested the man had done anything unlawful. That Kell was beginning to understand was rather the point of the entire system he had spent 5 months mapping. Almost none of it, technically, broke any law that anyone was prepared to enforce. It had simply been built with extraordinary care so that the people who built it would never have to. Pemberton Hale called him in on a wet February afternoon, the case file finally closed, thick enough by then to require its own dedicated cabinet drawer. "London's pleased," he said, which from Pemberton Hale amounted to a parade. "You'll get a commendation, possibly a promotion, if the right people remember your name by summer, which I wouldn't count on." "And the banks, sir? The Combine? The people who actually wrote the September memo?" "Some will answer for it eventually. Most won't. You know that as well as I do." Pemberton Hale closed the drawer with a soft, final click, the sound of an entire winter's work being filed somewhere it would very likely never be opened again. "You found the machine, Kell. That was never going to be the same thing as stopping it. I did try to tell you that back in October, when you still thought a mountain resort's hotel deeds were a matter of principle." Kell thought about Lisbon, and about the schools in Davos, and about how carefully someone in Berlin had once sat down and worked out that the safest place to hide a fortune was inside the things a decent man is trained never to suspect. "With respect, sir," he said, "I still think they were." Pemberton Hale allowed himself, for once, something almost like a smile. "Go home, Captain. Get some sleep. And for God's sake, next time a clerk in Bern sends you 3 lines about a health resort, try to develop the good sense to throw it in the bin, like everyone else would." Kell said nothing to that. He was, by then, quite certain he never would.